Good afternoon, and welcome to our last session on sustaining innovation. My name is Erin Nepler, and I'm part of our research team, and I'm looking forward to helping to facilitate our last session for you today. We're joined by three individuals for this session. We are joined by Karen DePaul from Virginia Tech, Lisa Tedesco from Emory University, and Suzanne Barber from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Over the past 2 days, our panelists have provided many examples on innovations that work. Examples that we've been talking about include telehealth, virtual dissertation defenses and thesis defenses, and virtual mentoring. Those are three examples that have commonly come up over the past 2 days. And nearly all of the respondents on the survey have indicated that there are innovations that they are hoping to continue. For example, 94% of institutions reported that their institutions would likely increase the number of classes offered in a hybrid format. And similarly, 83% reported that they would likely increase the number of courses offered entirely online. But despite some of these innovations that may stick around, we also know that there are some institutions that may have some impacts. For example, 79% of institutions reported that their STEM programs will at least be somewhat negatively impacted. And this ties into what we heard yesterday. For example, we heard that there may potentially be a delay or a discontinuation in STEM research that's happening at institutions. Similarly, retention issues are coming up for individuals that are tasked with childcare or other issues that may be coming up related to the pandemic. And while we know that industry is hiring, we also heard that yesterday, and that's great news for individuals that are looking and thinking about the career market. But we do know that the job academic prospects are also having an impact and that they may see some delays in hiring. For example, 84% of institutions have reported some minor budget cuts. Similarly, we also have heard that some institutions may, in fact, see a reduction in the class size that they have for students that are entering into the fall 2020 class. Keep in mind some context about this data was collected this summer. So this was certainly before we have experienced what's been happening at campuses across this fall. So one thing to point out is that's been coming up quite a bit is the fact that we have entered into a recession. We just heard from Clay Gluster at North Carolina A&T that they saw nearly a 7% increase in the number of students this fall. So I'd be curious to see how the enrollment numbers across other institutions are shaking up after everything that's been happening, both in terms of COVID-19 as well as with the social unrest and with the recession that's happening. And finally, one thing that has been continuously coming up over the last 2 days, and as Dana Williams from Howard noted yesterday with the dual pandemic, a number of schools have indicated that the pandemic has highlighted broader issues around social and racial unrest. And these are issues that I hope that we continue in this session as well as after this convening, as they're important issues to continue to raise across our campuses throughout the United States. So now I'd like to turn it over to our panelists for this session. We're going to start with Karen DePaul from Virginia Tech University. And Karen, if you could just give us a brief overview of the students you serve and the graduate programs that you have at Virginia Tech, and then we'll pass it on to Lisa and Suzanne and ask them to do the same, and then we'll get into some of our questions and the discussion for today.
Okay, great. Thanks for everyone staying with us. It's been productive and informative 2 days. Virginia Tech, our full name is Virginia Tech Polytechnic Institute and State University. We are one of the 2 land grant universities in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We have 30,000 enrollment, and almost 6,800 of those are graduate students. We are located primarily, I'm in Blacksburg, Virginia, rural part of the state, but Virginia Tech has a growing presence in the greater Washington, D.C. area. We've been in that area we've celebrated last year 50 years of graduate education in Northern Virginia, and we have locations in Roanoke, Newport News, Richmond. So we're one of these distributed universities and graduate education is that which has been outside of Blacksburg. We offer about 150, 160 different master's and PhD programs. Most of those are here in Blacksburg, and mostly are full-time students here in Blacksburg. Even though our name, Virginia Tech, would imply that we are primarily STEM, our largest college is engineering. Our second largest graduate college is the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences. So we are, we have a full range of graduate programs. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Lisa, we'll turn it over to you.
Well, I wanted to say thank you for your generous support in getting our panel together. And thank you too, Deborah, for the invitation and for this great project serving the graduate project nationally and internationally. At Emory University, graduate education is centered in the Laney Graduate School. And we are one of 9 academic units. The overall population of Emory for student population is about 15,000, and 7,000 of these are grad professional degrees. 2,000 of that 7,000 are in the Laney Graduate School. We're mostly doctoral, with about 15% academic masters and 1 or 2 applied master's programs. We have substantial strength in the biological biomedical sciences, and they comprise about 2/3 of the STEM population, but the entire STEM population is about half of the graduate school student population. As a university, we are a comprehensive research university. We have strong professional school representation, except for, and in the health sciences, we have full representation with very strong public health sciences as well. The only other thing I would add is that we're a central graduate school. And that means we confer the academic master's degrees and we confer the PhD. And the other units confer the professional degrees, the JD, the MD, the MPH, the MBA, et cetera, the theology degrees, et cetera. So that creates a good structure for accountabilities and levers for a range of things, many that we've been discussing.
Thank you, Lisa. And Suzanne, we'll turn it over to you for a brief introduction.
Sure, thank you. And I want to echo Lisa and Karen's comments of thanking NORC for putting this together, for giving us the opportunity to come together and talk about these important issues. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be on this panel. So UNC Chapel Hill is part of the UNC system. I imagine Clay told you a bit about the system earlier. We're the flagship university in the system. We enroll upwards of 27,000 students altogether. About 8,200 are graduate students, so we're close to 1/3, not quite 1/3 of the student body. The graduate school administers most of the graduate degrees on campus. There are a few that sit outside the graduate school. They tend to be more the professional graduate programs. We've got about 80 programs, 160 degrees. We tour a very strong biomedical campus, the large medical school, dental school, nursing school, pharmacy school, school of public health, all of which have graduate programs, many of which are managed by the graduate school. But we've also got other schools here on campus, including a school of engineering, a school of social work, a school of library sciences, a school of journalism. And so again, we have a very diverse array of degrees that are managed through the graduate school. UNC is a Carnegie classification highest research activity institution. We're top 10 when it comes to NIH funding among public universities in the country. Top 5 actually when it comes to NIH among public research universities. And so you can probably imagine that our research enterprise is a very large part of what we do. A large part of what our graduate programs do is to support the research enterprise. That said, graduate students here at Carolina are also heavily involved in our teaching mission, and increasingly they're doing very, very important things around the state in ways that not only benefit the students, but also benefit the communities they come from and the communities that are served by this institution.
So now we're going to open it up for our panel. We're going to move to the discussion component of it. It is now commonplace to say that universities, including graduate education, will be forever changed because of this pandemic. In what ways and towards what ends? And are there positive innovations that are sustainable?
I think universities will definitely be changed forever. If they're not, I will be bitterly disappointed, because this is an opportunity that we need to leverage to improve higher education and to improve graduate education. And I guess a couple of things that immediately come to mind about the change in graduate education. I think some attitudes about from faculty and grad students in the university, I think have changed, and I hope that will change. And one of them is around, which has been mentioned several times in the last couple of days, about virtual examinations, final defenses. And I was happy to see that there's a lot of the universities that are going to move to those because they haven't had them. We've had that at Virginia Tech, but the attitude that I appreciated the most was from grad students who said, my family could join, others could join, and I could share more of my research. And I think that is a reality. It's a statement, a positive. And the other one was from faculty that said, oh yeah, I guess it's not that bad to have that final oral exam in a virtual setting. And so we're changing the attitudes, I think, around having more of what we do in graduate education to be more transparent, to be more visible. And someone earlier said maybe more civil, but it's really, I think it's so important that people understand, not in the university and outside of the university, that what we do is very important, and now we can share that. So I have other things, but I'll just stop with that one and let my colleagues jump in.
I'm happy to weigh in too. I think certainly at my institution, and I think this is the case at other institutions as well, graduate students are in the spotlight in ways they haven't been before. And I think there's been an assumption that graduate students are kind of part of the fabric, and the teaching gets done and the research gets done, and there's this little army of people who somehow manage to make a contribution. But we've had more conversations about graduate student mental health, about graduate student food insecurity, about housing insecurity, about mentoring and abusive mentoring than I've heard in a very, very long time. And I say that having been at several institutions and been involved in graduate education at those institutions. So in a lot of ways, I think for those of us in the graduate education community, the iron is really hot right now. Graduate students are front and center, and I think it behooves us to try and keep that iron hot and keep them front and center as best we can. How do we do that? I think we keep on pushing. A lot of our institutions are going into a time that's going to be very much fiscally constrained. And I think it will be very easy for the concerns and needs of graduate students to fall off the radar screen in favor of some other things that will certainly become priorities for our institutions. And I think it'll be important for us as graduate deans and other folks who are involved in graduate education to stay at the bully pulpit, keep the trumpet going, and make sure that our graduate students, who certainly as we go into these economically challenging times are going to be as challenged, if not even more challenged than other students are, we want to make sure that stays in the forefront.
I think that was a really sort of powerful image that the iron is hot, and we need to keep that iron hot. And I think in many ways we've been telling each other's story over these hours of these 2 days, with the disruptions, the shape of the disruptions, the shape of our responses to the disruptions, the shape of the pivots that we've all had to make, and not to mention the daily surprises that are part of the unexpected and unimaginable in some cases. I think for me, what I'd like to add is from the perspective of some of our language and our understanding of the language that we're using, in terms of the word crisis, I think it's falling short of describing what this experience has been globally. It's been cataclysmic and devastating. And I think our word pandemic, we have to understand it in its full global galactic context. So that for me, I'm thinking that the intellectual space is going to change around what our students are asking and how they're asking the questions. I think it will change for some of our faculty, whether they're in the social sciences, the natural, biological, biomedical, or the humanities. How the interplay of all of the impacts from the pandemic and all of the changes that the world has experienced, I think it will show. I'm hoping that it will show in the shapes of our programs, where we'll continue to press on and stop using the word department and think about our programs and our faculty much more permeably and much more in a much more interdisciplinary way. And I certainly hope that we start to cue our structures, that this is queuing us up, and this is sort of like hot, to keep that hot readiness, sort of hothouse and iron imagery going, that we're in this hothouse of time where we can really press on with reshaping some of these things that don't reproduce the departmental notions, and sort of produce some more of the permeability across departments and fields. In terms of STEM, I'm really hearing from some of our students a greater interest in public-facing science and increased commitment to communicating science. There are lots of conversations about visible and intentional orientations to telling the truth, and how we use science and the methodology and rigor of science to tell the truth. So there might be an opportunity for us to rededicate ourselves to conversations and programming around responsible conduct of research, and all of the range of processes and programming we can do there. I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk more about policies and accountabilities, but I'll just stop here for now.
And if I can be, Erin, if I can jump in, because I want to echo what my colleagues have said, but Lisa, I think the interdisciplinarity and the transdisciplinarity is really important, and it leads me to one of the things that university has changed in grad ed is about the use of technology, but acknowledging the virtual space, because in that virtual space or spaces, I think is where we can bring people into our disciplinary, settings and making them more interdisciplinary. I don't want us to go back into disciplinary silos, but using the virtual space to reach out across disciplines, across speakers, across the world. So I think we have now greater opportunities to not just go online and put courses online, but to think more broadly, and even hybrid doesn't do it for me. It's really kind of the real virtual space in which we are cutting down some of the boundaries and the walls that we have had before. So I'm hoping that will change. It is changing right now, and I don't want to lose that. So we need to keep the fire hot. And I think it is very important that as grad deans in grad schools, we think very seriously about the meaningfulness and the relevance of our graduate degree programs. And that has to be front and center.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying, Karen, and what you're saying leads me into a conversation about access too. You know, another theme I think we've heard over the last couple of days is that by moving into the virtual space, we've also increased access to a lot of our programming and ultimately to some of our academic programs as well.
Yes.
And you know, economic downturns are unpleasant, but they also offer opportunities. And I think one thing we may find is that there's a very different kind of student who needs some sort of credential. It may not be a degree program, it may be a certificate, could be an even smaller nugget than that, but they're going to need to come back to graduate school to retrain, maybe to upskill, to stay competitive in the job market. And, you know, a lot of our institutions will always be in the business of training the next generation of scholars and researchers, the next generation of educators. But I think there's another group of folks out there who are probably going to need us in the next few years. And it may behoove us to start thinking about how we reach out to those individuals, how we engage them, the kind of programming they're looking for, whether we can somehow dove that programming into our more traditional degree granting programs, the things we're comfortable with, by thinking about things like stacking, and also whether this is an opportunity for us to open up the world of graduate education to people who would never have considered it as something that's potentially a part of their lives. You know, to be completely mercenary as well, I think there's probably a bunch of paying customers out there who'd be happy to come back and get a credential, and they might not want it to be called a master's degree. They might not want it to even be called a certificate. Maybe it's a badge, but you know, as we go into this time of economic crisis as well, there may be a mercenary reason for thinking about this too. But to me, it all goes back to access and the idea that now that we've broken at least one barrier, the idea that we can deliver quality graduate education at a distance, and we can do that on the fly if we have to. Let's think more about other pieces that are of the puzzle that are limiting access now, and think about how we can break down our graduate education and deliver it in ways that allow others to have the access they need to move their careers forward.
And Lisa, you had mentioned, you know, that you wanted to bring up some policies and procedures. We did get a question from one of our audience members. And I remember whenever I was doing my dissertation defense, that this was not something that was permissible. So do you envision that dissertation defense committees are going to perhaps in the future involve more faculty from outside of your university? If this is something that's not in your current policy, do you see this as expanding and providing the opportunity to bring more individuals in and perhaps change some of the policies and procedures?
Right. We actually do permit that. We have a minimum number that have to be graduate faculty at Emory, and then we have an approval process, and it's through the dean's office. So the whole notion of defenses and what we heard some colleagues report about families showing up and international collaborators, that's fantastic, absolutely fantastic. The notion that collaborators, laboratory collaborators or others from other parts of the world can show up, that's a pathway for that student. And for all the other students in the lab of that professor, it's a fabulous opportunity, and the faculty are figuring that out, so that change creates some advocacy for students and some real agency for faculty, which I think is important. I'm thinking about policies and accountabilities in a sort of a correlative way, if you will. You know, we have a lot of programs that butt up against each other, that share sort of nomenclature and methods and fields, and faculty may be in two different programs that produce the students, and they may have labs with students from two different programs that are resident and part of their research work. And so what we're seeing is that, you know, degree requirements, handbooks, they're not written as systematically for shared experiences and shared disciplines. Like 3 or 4 of our graduate programs in an interdisciplinary biological biomedical program have the word molecular in them. Now, there are lots of different questions, and I won't even press on that. Of course, there are as many questions as one can imagine that around the construct of the molecular construct. But that said, the students have come to us and asked us, well, now that we're in this pandemic mode and we're all seeing what each other is doing in a different way, why do I have to do this and this student doesn't have to do this? So we're confronting those issues in their visibility and in how their degree of being actionable, and in some ways communicating across the STEM disciplines about what does it mean to fulfill these requirements. The other piece of this is that if they're not clear, some people will be in the club and they will understand the meaning, and some people will not be in the club. And historically, that cleave has come to create inequities for women and for students from historically underrepresented groups who may not feel as comfortable or as included in these conversations. So we're facing this and gauging what we can do to stimulate faculty to move in directions that will open up discussions about aligning policies and practices systematically.
And we too are looking at a variety of policies and procedures. And I often ask the question, why we have some of the policies, and if I can't come up with the answer, then it's about time to do a change. And I want those to stay. I mean, we base our policies on some kind of principles, and the principles may not vary, but how the policies are written might. And I want to bring up a doctoral residency as an example too, because I know there's various ways in which we have doctoral students can earn residency. And I think it's time to revisit that, less about how long and where, but how they can achieve the principles underlying the residency. So I think one of our tasks right now is to take a look at our policies, understand what our principles are, and make those adjustments.
And the only thing I'll add is that I think this is also an opportunity for us to look at our policies and ask whether they're policies that were written for a face-to-face world, will transcend and work in a virtual space. And you know, it may be that there's a need for a separate set of policies for folks who are in the virtual space. There may be an opportunity for some compromise, but I think a lot of us now are in the business of kind of shoehorning our virtual programs and virtual students into a very imperfect mold. And maybe this is an opportunity for us to step back and say, let's change the mold.
Bucking the system, that's good. So speaking of that, one of the questions from audience members is, some institutions are providing limited graduate credits for relevant work experience. Is anyone considering admitting students with no undergraduate degree into their graduate programs?
An interesting question. I can start by saying that that's not something we have considered. What we are doing, though, is looking a little more carefully at some of our curricula and asking the question, to what degree does this serve students who aren't interested in academic careers, and B, maybe coming in with a different set of lived skills than others are. We're maybe a little bit behind the 8 ball on this, but we're in the midst of a pilot now, wherein we're no longer requiring the GRE at the graduate school level, and that's something that's new for this institution. But I think it was an important step for this institution because we are a fairly traditional place. We're a place that is I think if you ask most people on campus, they would tell you that the graduate school is in the business of training the next generation of researchers and scholars. We still think about dissertations in a way that is very much related to preparing people to take that next step and quote unquote go out on the job market. And so again, I think we're at a crossroads, and I think this crossroads offers us the opportunity to look beyond the traditional. And when I say look beyond the traditional, I mean not just in terms of traditional students, but also in terms of the traditional programming that we offer. But yeah, to date, we have not had conversations about folks without undergraduate degrees.
That's not been a conversation at Emory, well, in the Laney Graduate School, even within our governance bodies. But I absolutely agree that it's really something to be examined in relation to access and to serving the public good, if you will. Part of why higher education suffers sometimes is because people don't understand what we do, and we don't have a broad enough platform. And so this is one opportunity to increase access in ways that would address that. And there could be some equivalences that so many credits of this then translates into a reach back type of structure for awarding the baccalaureate if it were allowed in accreditation sequences. I mean, it's not impossible I mean, it's not unimaginable. I think it's a great idea.
And at Virginia Tech, we also have not had a deliberate, if you will, conversation about admitting people without undergraduate degrees. But what we have been talking about and will do is allow departments to do evaluations of the credentials and the background information or background needed to pursue a graduate degree in a different area. We're still pretty traditional, I think, in grad schools in a number of ways where, typically one would get an undergraduate degree in something and then go into a graduate degree that's similar to that. And I think we are moving away from that. And I think it's important that we do that. I think it would be a kind of a tough sell to not allow or not to require an undergraduate degree, but it is very much worth looking at to see if that is a tradition that we are holding to that no longer applies. And Suzanne and Lisa, you both talked about, and I totally agree with the accessibility. That is something that the second pandemic that we are facing right now, or third pandemic, the economics, we have to consider that. And that will change higher education and should change graduate education when we bring in the pandemic and the issues there, the social and racial justice, and the accessibility issues. It's the confluence of those three things that I think are so important right now for the change and keeping the fires going.
Right. It's a real opportune moment for the elites to address their inaccessibility and take a page from our colleagues who have been doing this for a long time and at very high levels of quality and engagement.
Absolutely. And in some ways, I think it brings us full circle. This is going to be an imperfect metaphor, but to give you an example, my grandfather had a high school education, but by the time he retired, he was effectively working as a chemical engineer. And the reason he was able to do that was he was smart, he was skilled, and all he had to do was prove himself. He didn't have to have a piece of paper to document his skill sets. And so, I think this is ripe for a rethink. I agree.
And I think too that right now graduate education is focused more on one institution, and that's where we all are right now. We're at one institution. And yes, we have partnerships, but I think we could tear down some of those barriers and make it a lot easier for someone to have courses at certain institutions, and we call it transfer credit. And I know you all do that, but maybe we need to rethink those notions of what it means to be able to pick up a course from Emory, and then to go to some other college, even international. So, I mean, I'm not trying to break down everything right now, but maybe I am, because I think these are things that we absolutely must think about it, because we should be about education, graduate education, and not so much the credential that they get.
And thinking about some of the innovations, that we've talked about, such as virtual dissertation defenses, I think oftentimes, in the world where we are today, we're like, okay, if the Zoom meeting went okay, that was a success. But that really can't be the only marker. If it wasn't a total fail, it was fine. So in thinking about that, how are you all thinking about evaluating whether or not some of the innovations that you've been trying are actually working? Is there any way that you're kind of checking in on that after the innovations have been implemented?
I ask grad students a lot, and faculty, for their, for their feedback and comments. And as it is happening, I'm teaching a class on preparing the future professoriate, and I feel like every Monday part of the conversation is what is working, how can this improve, how do we need to move things forward, and acknowledging that this is a work in progress, and grad students and faculty are partners in that change. Relative to the online exams or other things that we're doing, I specifically ask the faculty or the students for their feedback, because this is a continuous improvement process.
Yeah, same thing is true here. We've done a lot of surveying periodically to assess how folks feel about the the environment that we created and the programming we created and the technology that's being used to underwrite all that. As an institution, we're also engaging not just students and faculty in those conversations, but also staff, which I think is really important. That's one of the things I think we often forget on our campuses. We think about students and faculty, and we don't necessarily think about that glue that tends to hold programs together. And it's not uncommon we come up with this fabulous idea that faculty love and students love, but the staff who actually have to push the button and make it go say, whoa, that we can't do it that way. And so I think, another lesson learned from this experience, and one that I hope will stick, is the idea that we're a university community that consists of students, faculty, and staff, and that we need to engage their voices when we make these changes.
I would echo my colleagues' comments as observations here. Trying to keep things running and moving and people engaged is a 24/7 job, it seems, and the assessment is part of that, making sure they're staying on track and monitoring. What I'm going to be asking some questions about, and perhaps informally, and letting our directors of graduate studies and program directors be the real voice, is the arrangements, for example, in the STEM disciplines that are laboratory oriented, where we're conducting everything with high protocols for virus mitigation and prevention. And there are 3 shifts, 3 8-hour shifts, and students are protected from some of the hours that would be inhospitable or inappropriate, perhaps. But embedded in those conversations are the students being asked to take the night shift systematically. Are students with families having to say no and disadvantaged because they're not in the environment to be able to get feedback and do their work because they're not coming in at 2 a.m. For our students during the murders this summer, we had some students that were afraid to come to campus because of police insecurity around police protection and racial injustice. And so that when students got to campus, they felt very safe. It was a space between their home and arriving on campus and perhaps being stopped. So all of these conversations about hours of work, time of day, increased a sense of understanding vulnerabilities and increased the sense of understanding vulnerabilities in the context of the full impact of the pandemic and the layering of racial equity and social justice and safety.
Okay, we have another question from the audience. Let's see. So we know that from the popular press, many institutions, or at least what we've seen in the popular press, is that many institutions are going to suffer serious financial challenges in the years ahead. Could you address from your own institutional perspective or your broader understanding how you think these financial challenges are going to impact our capacity to sustain innovations going forward?
I think all three of us, well, all of us are going to kind of struggle with answering that. My first thought is it won't be easy with the financial constraints, but it is a must. We have to sustain the innovations. And I think that we will find over time that maybe it doesn't cost as much. If we're talking about doing things differently, we're already doing, I'm sure the rest of you are. I mean, all the things, all the money that we have poured into trying to make safe spaces and the distancing, the masks, et cetera, and the labs, those expenses have already happened. And so I think that we can, sustain them. I don't want to tear down all of those things that we just paid for to put up. Let's find a way to continue to move that forward. So I think we have to sustain them because the current model of higher education is much too expensive. And so therefore, we'll go back to the accessibility. I mean, we have to think about how we do things differently.
And frankly, I think I agree with Karen completely. And I think market forces are going to force us to sustain them. I mean, we're not going back to where we were. Students are going to expect more flexibility. They're going to expect us to kind of meet them where they live, sometimes literally. And we're going to have to be in a position to do that. And if we can't do it, I'm thinking in terms of we being the elite public universities, then they're going to go someplace else and get that education. I not to be Pollyanna, but I like to think, again, if we think outside the box about graduate education and think about it as more than just a collection of degree granting programs and think more about some of the more non-traditional audiences we can engage, that there may be the possibility of new revenue streams that we haven't had before. Certainly we don't have them in a strong way here at my institution. That takes investment, it takes time to develop, but again, I think we're at a really unique crossroads where there are going to be a lot more folks who need to come back and get a credential. They're going to expect to have that credential delivered to them in a quote unquote non-traditional manner. And we need to position ourselves to be able to make that happen. And I know it's not going to be easy. It takes buy-in from faculty. Faculty are accustomed to doing things in a certain way, and they've been rewarded for doing things in a certain way for a long time. But part of our role as leaders, I think, is to try and shift those role and responsibility and reward systems so that our faculty recognize the value add and the responsibility we have to shift as the times demand.
I would certainly agree with my colleagues there as well. And I would add that we have to focus on the mission. And if the mission, if we're at universities with a strong research mission, to be able to deliver it, it means we have to mount what it means to, to have graduate students to be able to work with faculty and to retain those faculty and to hire other faculty who want to be engaged with research. So and if you go up one more level, institutions may have to redefine their mission or re-articulate where they're putting their resources as a result of the economic sequelae of the pandemic. And if some institutions are decreasing their commitments to the research environment, but increasing their commitments to applied and professional environments, how can we partner with those institutions that are going to sustain a research mission to have engagements, because it's the practices and the innovations and the technologies from the research that will influence the professions, that will influence service delivery, that will influence the dissemination of technology and the sort of the engagement of new ways of working and doing things, the adaptability of things. So I would, I think that there may come a time where institutions have to check out the sort of the emphases and how they're delivering on their mission, and how we may, in the graduate community, be talking about how we can partner and serve each other differently.
Speaking of, serving the students differently, one of the things that has come up is just the increase of moving to online courses. And we found from the survey that 83% of the institutions report that they're most likely going to offer a large number more classes entirely online. Are there any concerns with the large-scale move to online learning? Is there, any new quality control frameworks that are being put in place at your institutions with these changes? Yeah, just to ensure that it's high-quality learning, that students that they are getting the same type of learning and environment that they would try to get in a face-to-face situation.
Right. I mean, I think that we talked a little bit about that earlier, the incidental learning that happens and those things. I worry about inclusion and the ability of everyone in the classroom to really get to know points of view and express points of view, and the capacity of the faculty member to manage difficult conversations in this distance virtual way. We're all committed to building environments where every student can do their best work. And that means that we have to understand what it means to have inclusive pedagogies and deliver and make sure then students are doing the work with each other in those ways. So I think it's something we have to tackle with some vigor.
I want to, I agree, Lisa, and so I want to reflect a little bit on the inclusive pedagogy or inclusiveness that can come from, that will be a result of the situation that we are in right now, because we have to reach the students. We have to reach each other in different ways. And that means we have to be more inclusive, because one size does not fit all. I'm connected very much with our disability studies and disability community here. And I keep hearing from them, we should have been doing this all along, and I think our practices, it's kind of like universal design, is more inclusive. And so we need to think that way. And so by being more inclusive pedagogy, we should be automatically then much more sensitive to and inclusive of those with identifiable disabilities and those which are not visible or not identifiable. And that's a whole nother conversation we can have about mental health, et cetera. But Erin, I want to go back to the question, and as I heard it, part of it, yes, we do need to evaluate online learning, but I want us to move away from online versus hybrid versus face-to-face, because we need to evaluate learning. And I want us to not just think, okay, online is that traditional way that we think about online learning, and think about it, in the space that we are in right now. I mean, and so it should be about evaluating, learning. And yeah, we're gonna fail at a few things. We already have at the universities, but I don't want to. I want to set it up as a virtual learning environment and evaluate the learning.
And I agree completely with Karen. That was one of the points I was going to make. The other point I'll make goes back to Lisa's comments about inclusion. I think one of the things that scares me, quite frankly, in our virtual environment is that um, with people not being on campus together, interacting in both formal and informal spaces, I think there's a lot of that cross-cultural learning that's going to be lost. And I worry, especially on the undergraduate level, but I think this is true on the graduate level as well, that our students aren't going to get the same opportunity to learn to respect and appreciate the quote unquote other that they have when they're able to interact in person. When only one or two people are in a lab, when does somebody get to taste the really cool snack that comes from a country that they've never heard of before? And so, I don't know that we can recreate that in a virtual environment, but it may behoove us to think about the courses we're offering and to try to offer them in such a way that students have small team projects and have an opportunity to interact with each other offline in ways to try to drive those, those very informal yet important aspects of the learning environment, the culture that we have at an academic institution. Else, I fear our students will leave our institutions with terrific technical skills and maybe some halfway decent communication skills, but not with those really humanistic skills that allow them to understand and appreciate people who aren't like them and don't share their lived experience.
I worry a little bit about the fact that, community is so important, and face-to-face engagement. And I worry as I wander around, campus, and I see people not making eye contact. We're behind these masks, and for some reason we're behind the mask, and so we can't look at people. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but and even all the the physical distancing. So you don't see people coming together, and I know exactly why we are not. But what is the long-term effect, on our behaviors? What's the long-term effect or the current effect of mental health and these kind of challenges? And as a grad school and grad dean, I think we absolutely need to do everything that we can to, number one, acknowledge that and put in programs and opportunities where we don't lose that community that we have built.
And maybe now that we're in an online space, those of us who don't have terribly diverse campuses, and define diversity in any way you like, maybe we have the opportunity to build bridges with other institutions so we can bring that diversity in remotely. That may be another positive, another upside of being in this virtual environment.
I think one of the audience members, Karen, may have picked up on something that you said. You all have, and we're extremely proud of the innovation that's been emerged and you all have been talking about. And we've been hearing a lot about the great work that's happening. But looking at the other side of the coin, are there any examples of work that you all have tried on your campuses that perhaps may not have worked so well?
Well, communication. I was trying to, and I don't think it's getting directly to what the question was, how it was asked about maybe some of the, the failures. But what comes to my mind is that we have, as an institution, not been able to communicate to the audiences and the constituency groups very well. So I'll just give an example from Virginia Tech. We have been doing a great job of communicating to students, undergraduate students. And so I had to jump in, and I think a lot of probably my colleagues and everybody else have had to come in and kind of change that language from student, meaning undergraduate student, to include graduate students, but graduate students are also employees and assistants. So I don't think I'm directly answering what the individual asked, but I think we have learned more about how we think we are communicating and we're not. And people, our students, our faculty and staff, they want answers in a way that they can consume them, they can receive them, and it's not a page and a half of flowery language. It's like, what is the statement that I need to, what is it that I need to take away? That's part of the society we live in. So.
Right. So many of the policies that we stood up for virus mitigation were very much inflected by the undergraduate experience. So that we worked the grad school and the professional school deans worked very hard to make it much broader and more inclusive, in fact, and more relevant to those student populations. But all of that said, I'm trying to, the other place that we had some challenges of things that didn't work and did work were how to help faculty, give faculty agency in talking about a student in your setting was identified, there'll be contact tracing. Those things were very slow for uptake because we were advocating in the response groups that I was leading, we were advocating for templates that would be easily adaptable across units to give faculty that agency to do that work and manage their environment. But that said, I'm trying to think of things that didn't work immediately in the academic or course delivery area. And for us, it was probably around how we were shaping the deferral process for the fall and how much would go online. Did a program have to go completely online or could it be hybrid? And there were fits and starts, and but we finally landed where we needed to land. And it was very difficult and very time consuming because we didn't know what we were doing, clearly, for a little minute.
Yeah, and same here, Lisa. And I'd say the place where we stumbled the most was probably with international students, especially those of our international students who couldn't get back in the country. You know, there were travel bans, there were visa issues, and some of these were students who were not only expecting to join us in August, they were also expecting to be TAs or RAs. And so, of course, when all the instruction shifted online, programs assumed, well, then my student can just teach from abroad. And it's not that simple. It's not that easy to pay somebody who's outside the US, especially if they don't have a US bank account. And to be honest, it took us a long time to figure that out. First, we didn't know who needed to be at the table to have the conversation. And in the end, we had our Office of University Counsel, we had risk management, we had Office of Research, we had folks from UNC Global, the graduate school. We all banged our heads against the wall for a long time. Learned a lot about taxation, a lot about international law, a lot about export control. And we came up with a process that works, but it is somewhat imperfect and so imperfect. And it took us so long to do it that we weren't able to employ our international graduate students who couldn't find their way back into the country. You know, we hope that students will be here with us in the spring. I think we're a little better prepared to handle things if they aren't, but we all learned a tremendous lot about international student employment.
I'll add something relative to undergraduate education that I have picked up from my colleagues, and that is about testing, you know, the final examinations, because I think many faculty members went into it thinking, okay, well, I'll just do, you know, the test the way I normally do and have somebody monitoring, you know, behaviors. And that didn't work. And there's not a tool that can resolve all of that. But what it did is raise the issue of how do I evaluate, you know, the learning. So now I'm seeing, rather than multiple choice, true, false, multiple choice, it's rather than doing just a final test, it is other ways of evaluating the, you know, the performance. And so out of that failure of people caught cheating at the undergraduate level, it caused people to rethink, okay, so how do I do this? Do I do more case studies? Do I do more open-ended questions? Do I do self-grading, self-evaluation? And really, those are all examinations and inquiry into the pedagogies that we use and could adopt.
A little bit about some of the power dynamics that you see with graduate students and faculty and some of the employment that happens. And Jim talked a little bit about some of those employments that are happening at institutions. And one of the main recommendations that has come out of the NASEM report is that graduate schools need to reduce their reliance and dependence on graduate students and faculty. And do you think that there's any change, there are any changes of innovations that have been happening during this time? Do you think that that COVID could potentially impact the dynamic that happens between graduate students and faculty in terms of thinking about some of those power dynamics that potentially could happen?
Let me put a positive spin on the power dynamics, because what I saw with GTAs, and we have an Academy for GTA Excellence, and what I found happening from the summer through now the fall was a decrease in that power dynamic, because some faculty and others realized that the grad students are a great source for teaching and learning and changing something. So they became more junior, colleagues. And there were several of our faculty and departments said, I couldn't have done it without a GTA. And that helped me adjust my class. So that's kind of changing the dynamic. But I've also seen, the others where, there may be a greater divide of power dynamic, but I wanted to focus on that piece.
It's a hard question, and it's hard because we have to examine the threshold for bullying and what it means to pressure students in ways for work that is going to advance the faculty and not necessarily advance the student. One of the saddest things I heard recently, I mean, not one of the saddest, but a sad thing that I heard recently is about a student who was ready to finish. They had everything completed, and the article was not accepted into the highest H factor journal, and the faculty member kept holding the student back until it was submitted and ready for a higher H factor journal. Now that, somehow that got to a limit of understanding what it means to be finished, completed, and exhibiting, demonstrating the original research skills that one is required to demonstrate as in the range of the PhD, right? And so we're getting to a level of having to articulate policies and practices and degree requirements to a degree that are visible, legitimate, and accepted by the community, so that these things don't happen. And did it happen just once? I don't know. I didn't ask systematically, but it's causing me to really examine with my lead team and with our faculty governance the questions around power and regulations and policies. And if we have these things systematically stated, does it help? Does it address? And then empowering people to report bullying like we do other kinds of conduct that have to be reported and examined.
And I agree. And I think those power dynamics can be even more complex if you're dealing with students from underrepresented groups too. When you're the only one and things happen to you, especially if you're not in a situation where the next student is right next door, you can't talk, you can't just tap someone in the shoulder and have a conversation. You don't know whether it's happening to you because you're a student or happening to you because you are the student you are.
Yeah.
And so I think our underrepresented students in particular are struggling with some of these issues. It's not a perfect world. There are faculty out there who don't necessarily have students' best interests at heart. At the same time, most faculty really care about their students and want their students to succeed. Everybody's under pressure right now. Students are under pressure, faculty are under pressure, staff are under pressure. And I think some people are cutting corners and not being as careful and as considerate and as compassionate as they ought to be. Right. And so, we have to navigate this very, very complex space, and it's just that much harder in this virtual environment when you can't reach out and touch somebody.
Right. Suzanne, you just motivated me to give a shameless plug to Julie Poussalt's book that came out within the last couple of months, Equity in Science. I mean, it really touches on a lot of these conversations, and there's a great chapter on admissions, recruitment, and inclusion. And you know, I mean, the story tells itself. Students will apply to those schools where these things are not, where the climate is the best.
I'm going to put in a shameless plug for the Disrupting Academic Bullying initiative that we have at Virginia Tech. It's been 4 or 5 years now, and check it out on our website. If I can get the website and post it, I'll do that, because it has some good, and it's run out of the grad school. Disrupting Academic Bullying.
Thanks, Karen. We'll definitely make that resource available. I know that that's another area of work that we do in climate, so very important and great to hear about that. So I'm going to ask you our final question, and this really ties into some of the comments that you all were just making about authenticity and making sure that we're not going through the motions. And, you know, we want to be as authentic as we possibly can during this time. And so how are we going to make a response to social justice real? How is it going to be real as we innovate in graduate education today? And how are we going to symbolize it and make it so that it's something that is sustainable and it's lasting, and that it does not look like we're just going through the motions because that's what's happening in society? How are you all going to make this real and lasting?
Diversify the faculty, diversify the student body, and keep these conversations going. And create offices of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to the extent possible, programming. You just have to keep it moving. And the whole notion of getting things, policies and practices legitimately stated and communicated and out there, so people have something to go to.
Yeah, and thanks, Lisa. I'll add one additional group to your list, and that is diversified leadership.
Yeah, okay,
Institutional
absolutely.
leaders, right? They're the ones that have the money. They have power. You know, if anybody's going to change roles, rewards, and responsibilities, it's institutional leadership. And you know, to date,
they have to hold the faculty accountable.
Absolutely.
Faculty hire. The faculty are the hiring group, and we have to make sure that the hiring is done to reach our goals.
And when we're hiring those faculty, we have to make sure we're hiring them for the right reason too.
Exactly.
Not just to tick a box, right?
Right.
Because ultimately we want them to persist in the pipeline so they can aspire to those leadership positions where they have the money and they have the power and they have the influence. But I would argue we spend a lot of time building I'll call it the lower end of the pipeline, the feeder part of the pipeline. We spend a lot less time thinking about whether we retain folks in that pipeline and ultimately groom them to be the institutional leadership that we need. And I think it's time for us to start paying attention to the other end of the pipeline.
I'm saying inclusion and diversity as well, because if we are inclusive, there's a far better chance we're going to be diverse. If we just focus on diversity and traditional thinking, we're not going to be inclusive, and that gets to the recruitment and the retention. I would also share that it was 3 years ago now that through the Commission on Graduate Studies and Policies, we were able to implement a diversity and inclusion responsibility requirement of all incoming graduate students. And so by the time our grad students leave, they will have gone through, and this is not just a quiz, this is an actual program that they have to go through. It's individualized by the department. But if you have, questions or comments, and that's not going to solve the problem at all, but it is helping to address that. We have a new graduate certificate in diversity and inclusion, a course on diversity and inclusion in a global society that I've been teaching for 10, 12 years here. These are all ways to pick at various pieces of how we put the mosaic together.
And if I could add just one other thing, I think we also need to be particularly attentive in this financial climate. You know, as resources become more and more limited, institutional priorities, well, they become apparent. In my experience, diversity, equity, and inclusion is one of those things that's thought of as being an add-on, not an integral part of the fabric. We've got to make sure it remains an integral part of the fabric, even after the TV cameras are gone and people are all back to work and there aren't folks in the street putting signs in their yards for Black Lives Matter. And that's going to be harder in this fiscal environment, but it's part of our responsibility.
Well, I want to take a moment to just thank the panel. You all have shared many things that are working well in terms of the innovations. You've also exposed a little things that aren't working as well. And we really appreciate your candor with us today. So thank you, Karen, Lisa, and Suzanne, for your time. I appreciate you joining us and sticking with us through the end. And now I'd like to turn it back over to Deborah Stewart, who is going to wrap it up for us. Deborah, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Erin. And thank you, Suzanne and Lisa and Karen. That was just an absolutely dynamite final panel. Thank you to all of the panelists today. The first two panels on innovation were also terrific, as we got some very practical and specific examples of the kinds of things that you've tried, both the technologically enabled things and simply changing kind of the rules of the game, how we actually go about our policies and our processes in graduate education. All of this was just enormously informative. And this last discussion, where we looked both at what was working and what didn't work in the context of sustainability, was immensely valuable, and I think the right way to end, because today is just, in a sense, it's a step along the journey, and it's a long journey. I was reminded as I listened, actually both to yesterday and today, and I was just glued to my screen the whole time. I was reminded of a talk that I heard given by a management consultant at the CGS summer workshop back in July. And I don't remember the consultant's name or the consultant's company, but I do remember what she said. She talked about resilience and what the kind of steps in a resilience process are as one is resilient, becomes resilient in response to the pandemic. And resilience, she said, is built as we take those actions first to respond to the crisis, and then to witness some level of recovery, and then to incorporate that experience of response and recovery into a way in which we will become more resilient, so that we're more effective to respond to the next crisis. Now, I won't say the next pandemic, because while I'm sure at some point it will come, I certainly pray that it doesn't come anytime soon. But reflecting on the last 2 days and thinking about that framework that this speaker provided about resilience, I do think that even an objective observer, and I hope I'm somewhat objective, would actually see the kinds of steps that have been described by our panelists over the last 2 days as really robust examples of resilience. We are responding. To be sure, we are responding, and we're responding in this kind of process that I do think demonstrates resilience and builds resilience. The real question is, will the lessons learned from this whole resilience building experience actually result, when we're on the other side of the pandemic, in producing a notably stronger, better form of graduate education in STEM fields at the master's and doctoral level than we have today. Whether or not we can build on those lessons learned is the big remaining question. We had talked earlier in the day, and we've written in our paper that innovation often emerges because of a window of opportunity. That window of opportunity that both creates a sense of urgency, frees us to do things that we might not have done previously, and focuses our energies by eliminating the tangential, unimportant kinds of things that we might be focusing on previously. To be sure, the path forward is not an easy one. It's one in which, as Carrie said yesterday, it's not like we're now at the end of the storm and we're sort of just cleaning up the destruction from the storm and then moving forward. We are still in the eye of the storm in many institutions, in many states, and there could be another storm coming in the fall. So the path forward's not an easy one. But these are the things that I think we can roughly say in summary. We can say that we do know that in some fundamental ways, our universities and our graduate schools and our policies and practices, many of them have changed and will change in irreversible ways. The university in many ways will never be the same because of the pandemic and because of the new understandings of the world that have been introduced to us through the pandemic. I think Lisa said something like the change is galactic, and that galactic change is that imagery, Lisa, will stick with me for sure. The change is going to result in a call for new structures. I think both Lisa and Karen talked about the need to fundamentally rethink the whole departmental organizational structure. It will result in new ways to try to create and sustain community. It will, both Karen and Suzanne talked about the way in which it will very likely introduce new packages of graduate education as we try to respond to new communities who have not been part of our student population previously. Karen talked specifically about how we need to rethink policies that are written for a face-to-face world to make them much more compatible with the online world. So what is true is that our universities in many ways will be changed forever as a result of COVID-19. We also know that as these changes unfold, they absolutely must be sensitive to these emerging demands for racial equity, emerging demands for a much more profound understanding of social justice, and emerging demands for, as Karen so clearly put, building a truly inclusive graduate community. And we know that all of this is going to take place in the face of really severe financial constraints. This I can tell you for sure. At NORC, we are deeply committed to incorporating the extraordinarily rich discussion that has taken place over the last 2 days in an effort to put serious flesh on the bones of the numbers that we've crunched out as a result of this survey. Flesh that will be made up of your thoughts, your concerns, your observations, and your nuances. That paper representing all of this will be out later in the fall, but you will be receiving after this conference an invitation to continue to provide input. We want to keep this dialogue going for sure, because again, telling the real story is going to depend upon the contextual, fine-grained, real world, in the space where it's happening, experience that only you can bring to this. You know, there's an old saw that I always used to resist in my days at the Council of Graduate Schools. That people would routinely tell me about graduate schools, not graduate deans, but those who are not so friendly to graduate deans. And they would say, it goes something like this. I'm not sure I have the exact words right, but it would go something like, graduate schools are scientific and technological revolutionaries, but they're political and institutional conservatives. Well, you know, the fact of the matter is there are things that are good and should be preserved about graduate education at both the master's and doctoral level. But what I've heard over the last couple of days is that there's a lot of revolutionary activity underway as well. Let me just say thank you all for participating in this conference. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for your engagement. Thank you to the panelists in particular for your fabulous presentations. Special thank you to my research colleagues at NORC, without whom this whole project could not have happened. A final very deep thanks to the graduate deans who are in the audience and those who are not. And beyond attending this conference, I just want to say thank you for what you're doing day in and day out as you deal with, in the words of my friend Peter Harries, that unique kind of thing that you encountered in March of this year. Please, let's keep this dialogue open. Let's continue the discussion. Thank you so much for being here. Have a good evening.